Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 8. His Weakness. Kiss her. Kiss her. Kiss her. Damon's eyes couldn't cast away from her lips. His brain had long ceased its normal functioning, and to make things worse, his wolf counterpart was pushing forward, trying to force himself to the forefront of his mind. If that's true, then what did you mean when you said you'd deal with me? Sarah was expectantly staring up at him, desperately waiting for a valid response to her question. However, Damon hadn't replied, and it didn't seem to Sarah like he was going to anytime soon. He wasn't even focused on what she was saying. Instead, he was focused on something else. Something that made Sarah's cheeks instantly go red. Her lips. He wasn't about to do what she thought he was about to do, right? He answered her question when he began to lean forward. Hazel eyes clouded over with an emotion that was hardly ever directed at her. Lust. Upon realizing it, she suddenly forgot how to breathe. Was this it? The moment she would have to give herself over to him, body and soul? The moment she would have to please him to his heart's content? To put it simply, she had forgotten all about that. But how could she have forgotten about why she came here in the first place? She was chosen by Damon, and therefore she was his sex slave, his possession for the rest of her life. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't shown a tinge of interest in her up until now that made it temporarily escape her mind. Humans were simply play toys for werewolves, a weaker species who could do nothing but bend to their will. All she was designated for was to pleasure her owner, nothing more, nothing less. She hated that fact, but it didn't matter whether or not she was okay with it. Damon seemed to be more than happy to light things afire. And strangely, she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea of kissing the living daylights out of him. Surely, there had been many times when Mr. Knack would use her to fulfill his desires, but this time around there was something different about it. Instead of wanting to pull herself back, she wanted to push herself forward. There was a strange feeling building up in the pit of her stomach, and a heap of pride grew against her chest relentlessly. It felt good. Good to have drawn some of his attention. Good to have his eyes pinned on her, and only her. But somehow, when she finally decided to close her eyes and await the euphoric feeling of his lips on hers, her mind had uncontrollably traveled to places that she didn't want to return to. Before long, she was stupidly convinced that the person in front of her was Mr. Knack. Then, without realizing it, she started to tremble. With all the raw fear dancing around in the room, Damon was forced to snap out of his mindless state. Even his wolf, who had earlier been pushing forward mercilessly, receded to the back of his mind. She was scared. His mate was scared. Damon leaned back to take a hard, long look at his mate, and he was sensible enough to perceive that her reaction wasn't simply because she feared him. These were the signs of past trauma. Her body was convulsing, her lips were palpitating, and her fingers were clenched onto the hem of her dress as if to keep it secured over her legs. Any idiot could tell that something very bad had happened to her before he met her. Something that maybe had a lot to do with the bruises on her skin. Damon drew in a breath. Anger was treading through him, so much so that his veins started to rise to surface, becoming visible on his arms. He tried his best to keep himself restrained, but his attempts went pretty much in vain. "I'm not going to touch you," he squeezed out through clenched teeth, but his hands were actually itching to grab her and pull her into his embrace. He literally had to tightly entwine his fingers to prevent his hands from reaching out to her. Trying so hard to hold himself back was new to him, but he had made a promise to himself 10 years ago that he wouldn't allow the mate bond to cloud his mind, and he was planning on keeping that promise for the rest of his life. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not even going to touch you," he repeated, raising his hands in surrender. He felt stupid and weird to have said something like that when he was used to saying the complete opposite, but he did it anyway and laid the complete blame on Sarah. It was her fault that he had to act so unnaturally. In fact, he considered everything to be her fault. She had suddenly came into his life and had caused a big ripple. He couldn't even keep his emotions in check at the moment, not to mention the day when they first met. He had been totally smitten by her. But luckily, he was reminded of how lethal a mate could be before it was too late. She was not simply a mate for him. She was his weakness, the only person who could mess with his head and make him feel things he didn't want to feel. "I'm so—" Sarah's sudden gasp for breath brought him out of his thoughts. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, while she tried to draw in as much air into her nostrils as she could. Her eyes, which had been wide with fear a few seconds back, were now staring up at him apologetically. Damon frowned. He wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. He was the one who attempted to do something he certainly wasn't supposed to do. Rather than being apologetic, he wanted some answers. His hands were already trembling with the need to kill. He just needed her to name all those who had dared to touch her. "I want to know who gave you those bruises," he suddenly demanded, catching her off guard. What? Sarah's face contorted into one of pure confusion. Somehow, she found herself feeling a little disappointed. She was apologizing for the unintentional turnoff, yet he had shoved their little moment aside and was now asking an unrelated question. Why did he want to know about her bruises anyway? She looked up at him, hoping to determine what he was up to, but all she could see was the anger in his eyes, nothing more. Sarah frowned, furrowing her brows. Damon surely had a knack for getting angry for no reason at all. "Who gave you the bruises, Sarah?" His voice was raised higher than before, and he had even called her by her name. That simply meant that he was completely serious, but Sarah couldn't manage to answer him. It wasn't that she didn't want to. It was just that she didn't want to remember it at all. And plus, it'd be stupid of her to name out the persons who had hurt her. What if they came looking for her because of it? Damon stared at her for around 30 seconds, jaw ticking as he tried to patiently wait for her reply. However, his patience had wore thin when another 30 seconds passed and Sarah hadn't even attempted to answer him. All the while she kept her gaze on her fiddling fingers in her lap. He could have forced her to answer him if he wanted to, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, no matter how much he wanted to. That was the power of the mate bond, the power he dreaded. Damon hollowed his cheeks in annoyance, slammed his hands against the table, then stood up. "Fine," he grumbled through his teeth without even sparing her a glance. "I'll do things my way." And then with that, he stormed off. The sound of the front door slamming shut soon filled her ear, causing her to jump at its ear-splitting loudness. And for the umpteenth time since she arrived, she asked herself the same question. Why is he angry? Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 9. Damon's Tantrum. For the rest of the day after their little episode, Damon didn't return home. Aside from herself, the whole mansion was only occupied by Trixie and Haggai, though considering those two as companions would be invalid, since they mostly acted as if she didn't exist. It was at that point in time that Sarah realized the absence of helpers. Damon was the Alpha King. It's only right that he has helpers to do everything he asks, cleaning, cooking, and so on. But oddly, he didn't have any. Damon Callisto was certainly a complete mystery. When the next day came, Damon was still nowhere to be seen. And though Sarah didn't really care all that much about Alexis specifically, she still noticed that she hadn't returned from wherever she had disappeared to either. Every time she thought about it, like really sat down and thought about it, that awful coincidence brought a very disturbing doubt to her mind. Sarah couldn't help but think that maybe they went out together for some alone time, without prying eyes watching them every step of the way. It was a ridiculous assumption since they both left at totally different times, but Damon obviously favored Alexis more than anyone else, so it was more than likely possible. Despite how disturbing thinking about that was, her days were still pretty good. Whenever she felt a little lonely, or the silence felt too deafening, she'd talk to herself and make complaints about Damon's negligence and his scary anger issues. Moreover, without Damon around, she could also eat whatever she wanted whenever she wanted. And for some reason, Haggai and Trixie had pretty much become her personal cooks. 3 times a day, they'd bring her something delicious to eat. It was only those 3 times that they actually acknowledged that she existed. The first time it happened, Sarah was surprised by it because they still seemed to hate her, judging by the irritated looks on their face when they handed her food to her. But Sarah shrugged it off. She was only interested in the food, so whether they liked her or not, it didn't matter. Sadly, though, the next day Damon returned, thankfully without Alexis in tow. From then on, her daily cooked food stopped coming. Well, it didn't exactly stop coming. More like the person who handed it over changed. Instead of Trixie and Haggai, Damon was the one who came 3 times per day. That was hella inconvenient because Sarah had already planned to ignore the heck out of him. The thing was, she was still flustered by their little kiss attempt despite the couple of days that had gone by. Whenever she saw him around the house, she simply acted as if he didn't exist. The same goes for whenever he brought her food to her room. But Sarah found herself to be immensely frustrated when she realized that Damon was doing the exact same thing. Ignoring her, that is. Hand the tray over, then leave. That was how it always went. He didn't speak to her, neither did he spare her a glance. What puzzled Sarah was why he went through the trouble of bringing her food when he obviously didn't want anything to do with her. One evening, she managed to bottle up her courage and was determined to ask that same question. However, her courage managed to die down the moment she laid eyes on him. Those fierce eyes of his were telling her something. Something along the lines of, "Don't talk to me or I'll kill you." Astonishingly, Damon was the first to initiate a conversation. He could feel her gaze penetrating the side of his face. It seemed like she wanted to say something, but she was apparently holding back her words. "What is it?" He pressed her to speak without looking at her. Sarah immediately tore her gaze away from him and moved it to the floor, thinking that he must have realized that he was staring at him. "I'm sorry," she apologized vigorously, fiddling with her fingers as she grew so nervous that she wanted nothing more than to disappear from his sight altogether. Damon frowned. He didn't need to look to know that she was fiddling with her fingers and shifting from foot to foot like an idiot. He noticed long ago that it was something she did whenever she was nervous or scared. He cocked his head to finally glance at her face, his forehead creasing. He was nervous as to what made her so nervous around him. He hadn't done anything that could possibly make her this way. He treated her much better than his own parents, for that matter. And plus, he even took it upon himself to bring her food every day. Wasn't that enough to make her less afraid of him? "What is it that you want me to do?" Sarah stiffened. She had no idea what he meant. And he also had no idea why he was suddenly speaking to her instead of going about his business. Then it occurred to her. Was he talking about that time? She had been the one who stopped them from kissing, so Sarah thought that must have been why he was interrogating her. Perhaps he wanted to know why she didn't cooperate. A shade of red started to coat her cheeks. "What do you mean?" "I want to know why you're still scared of me. I even forced myself to bring you food," Damon said matter-of-factly. Sarah blinked, suddenly feeling the need to slap herself. She had obviously thought wrong, and that somehow disappointed her. But her disappointment didn't last that much longer. She was rather baffled by what he had just said. His words gave her the idea that he had been bringing her food all this time because he wanted her to soften up to him. But that couldn't be it, could it? As far as she knew, Damon reveled in people's fear. It's what he practically feeds on, so why wouldn't he want her to fear him? "I'm not scared of you," Sarah lied through her teeth, keeping her eyes casted towards the door. "Then why aren't you looking me in the eye?" Now that he pointed it out, Sarah finally raised her eyes and looked up at him. His interrogation was making her uncomfortable as well as frustrated. "Earlier you weren't looking at me in the eye either. Was I supposed to assume that you were scared of me too?" Sarah scoffed. But the astonished look that covered Damon's face was what made her backtrack through those words. And as soon as it registered in her head that she had completely dug her own grave, Sarah slapped a hand over her mouth. Every word had came out of her mouth purely unintentionally. Even though she had been forced into submission for years while she was at the dungeon, her insolence still hadn't left her. It simply laid dormant inside her until dangerous moments like this, it would inconveniently show itself. If Sarah didn't know what she was doing, she would have even rolled her eyes at him. At that point, there would be no turning back because Damon would have probably plucked out her eyeballs. Scratching the back of her neck, she slowly eased her hand off her mouth and parted her lips to apologize. But before she could speak, Damon beat her to it. "Don't apologize." He didn't say it like he was asking her nicely. He said it as if he was commanding her. "We are mates, so I hope you understand that almost everything you do irritates me. I don't want to see you fiddling with your fingers, shifting your weight beneath your feet, struggling to speak, nor apologizing for every little thing you do. And do I need to keep reminding you that I cannot hurt you?" He raised his eyebrows. "Stop behaving as if I'll bite your head off. It's irritating, so just..." He sucked in a breath. "Just act naturally, like you did before you met me." He grumbled at the last part, feeling both stupid and annoyed at himself for practically throwing a tantrum. Instead of saying all of that, he should have just chained her up in his basement after she dared to scoff at him a few moments ago. Once again, he had done something out of the ordinary without even thinking much about it. He glanced over her once more in irritation before walking past her and unintentionally brushing their shoulders in the process. Tingles erupted against their skins, but neither of them acknowledged the sensation. "Hurry up and eat. Trixie and Haggai will be here to keep your company soon," he said as he walked over to the bed and settled the tray down. And then he left the room, leaving Sarah staring confusedly at the spot in which he had been standing. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 10. Doomsday. Sarah yawned openly, stretched her arms, then flew upwards in the bed with a large smile on her face. The sun was shining mightily in the sky. The birds were chirping their sweet songs, and as for Sarah, you could say she was in a very good mood. Ever since that little talk Damon had with her yesterday, she had been going around everywhere with a slight happy skip to her moments. For some reason, his words had made her feel unusually good. First, he made it known that he wanted her to soften up to him, and then he made it known that he wanted to get closer to her. The difference between the two was hard to realize, but Sarah knew exactly what separated them. When he insinuated that he wanted her to soften up to him, she wasn't really sure if he actually meant exactly that. But when he said he wanted her to act naturally around him, she was entirely sure of it. Damon Callisto was actually interested in her. Who would have thought? A rush of blood rose to her cheeks. Sarah had no idea why that made her feel so giddy, but she simply rolled with the emotion as soon as it came. It wasn't good to think too much about the perks of the mate bond nor try to figure it out. She'd probably go crazy. Sarah climbed off the bed and shambled over to the bathroom. She took a 15-minute shower, then came out with a towel drying her hair and another wrapped around her body. Water droplets trickled down to her skin and dripped to the floor, leaving a wet trail behind her. Just when she was about to unwrap her towel, a voice came calling out her name from behind the door. Her stomach dropped. Though she had only heard it a couple of times, she knew for sure that the voice belonged to none other than Alexis. Why did she have to return so soon? Sarah asked herself, resisting the urge to stomp her feet against the ground childishly. Now that Alexis was back, things would definitely get complicated. After all, she was the one who had gotten her in trouble last time. Who's to say she wasn't going to do something like that again? Sarah sighed softly and stood unmoving in her room, listening to Alexis as she called for her repeatedly. She thought that perhaps she would go away after a while, but Alexis did no such thing. She kept calling and calling until Sarah reluctantly decided to hear her out. Frowning, she quickly finished drying her hair with her towel. Then she tossed it somewhere in the room carelessly. Before opening the door, she puffed out her chest and held her chin high. Despite how much of a coward she was, she didn't feel like being taken advantage of anymore. If Alexis wanted to think she was running around looking confident and conceited, then so be it. That wasn't her problem. When Sarah opened the door, she was just about ready to tell Alexis a piece of her mind, but what she saw made her hold her tongue. If she was to be honest, then she'd say that Alexis was the prettiest among them all. She had long black hair, big blue eyes, a well-sculpted face, and a voluptuous body. Anyone with eyes would be able to tell how beautiful she was. But that was then. This is now. To put it simply, she didn't look very much beautiful at the moment. She looked rather terrible. Purple bruises scattered along her cheeks, and almost all of her face was swollen, to the point where one would think she had been bitten by 1,000 wasps. She was wearing a sleeveless blouse, so Sarah was also able to see the fingerprints that had been imprinted on one of her shoulders, the countless slashes that littered across her chest, as well as the chain imprint that was left on her back. She had been tortured. It was obvious. Who? Sarah's wide eyes ran over her battered body, a grim look taking over her features. Who did this to you? Alexis tucked her hair behind her ear, looking just about ready to break down into tears. Who else but him? Sarah's lip wobbled. She had an idea whom Alexis was talking about, but she didn't want to believe it. She hadn't known Damon for long, but she could still vouch that he wouldn't have done something so cruel. Why would he? She couldn't think of any reason he would have done it. Then Sarah suddenly remembered the day she had an argument with Alexis, and all the pieces began to fit together. There was blood on the stairs the following day, and it was also the same time that Trixie and Haggai began to ignore her. The reason why the other girls ignored her. The reason why she had found blood on the stairs, and the reason why Alexis had disappeared, was because Damon had been the one who hurt her. There was no one else who she could suspect, but him. Sarah's throat dried. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know how exactly she felt about this. She knew that Damon was the ruthless kind, but still, this wasn't right. Why did he hurt you? I thought... Yeah, I thought he was on my side too. Alexis nodded along with her words, her eyes pricking with tears. But then, as soon as you were locked in your room, he... Her tears started to run like a river out of her eyes. Sarah bit her cheeks as she watched Alexis cry in front of her. She pitied her, that was for sure. However, she still wondered why she had come complaining to her. What could she do to help? Absolutely nothing. She didn't have the authority to demand that Damon spare her when he barely even batted an eye at her whenever he saw her. But Alexis thought otherwise. Without warning, she stepped forward and gripped Sarah's hand tightly. I'm sorry for what I did. I really am. I get it if you don't want to forgive me, but at least do me a favor. He's going to kill me, I'm sure of it, she pleaded, tightening her hold at each word. She looked and sounded desperate. Way too desperate for Sarah's liking. Sarah shuffled back, pulling her hand out of hers in the process. She didn't understand what she was saying. How could she possibly help her in this situation? Getting mixed up in this whole thing would probably even get her in trouble as well. Plus, Alexis was the one who caused this upon herself. She should be the one to fix it. But as Sarah looked over her panic-stricken form, the words of refusal on her tongue dissolved into nothingness. Though she wanted to stay out of it, her conscience wouldn't let her do it. She didn't have the heart to leave her be when her life was being threatened, especially since it seemed as if Damon had done this because of her. What do you want me to do? But little did Sarah know that she had just signed herself up to meet her complete doom. Made It to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 11. Doomsday, Part 2. After Sarah and Alexis retrieved the key from Damon's drawer, Sarah began to move towards the basement, taking one baby step at a time. Within 5 minutes' time, she was standing in front of the basement door with the key wrapped up tightly in her hand. She was dreading meeting Damon at the moment. It was funny how a few moments back, she was guessing about how he was interested in her, and now, she was scared shitless to even approach him. Things had changed in that short length of time after one single revelation. You're his mate. He's bound to listen to whatever you say. You just need to convince him. Tell him you'll never forgive him if he hurts me. Those were the words Alexis had left with her, but Sarah wasn't sure she could pull it off. It wasn't as easy as she said. Right now, her whole body was trembling, and even her legs were threatening to take off in the other direction. But the only thing that was keeping her standing by the door was Alexis. This was all for Alexis. If Sarah turned back now, then her life would be in danger. Gulping thickly, Sarah stuffed the key into the designated keyhole and twisted before lightly pushing the door open. According to Alexis, Damon was supposed to arrive here in a few minutes, and when he does, he would be expecting to see Alexis lying, waiting for her next punishment. The plan was for Sarah to go there instead of her and try to convince him, but in the case that she doesn't manage to do so, Alexis would flee elsewhere. That was the plan, and Sarah was sadly the core of it. Sarah took a long glance down the staircase below her, then wrapped a hand around herself as she began to descend, whilst her eyes casted from one direction to the next. There was barely any light in the room, so Sarah could hardly even see. How did Damon plan to punish Alexis in such a dark place? Then again, he was a werewolf. His eyesight might still be perfect even in the dark. But just as Sarah stepped down the last stair, a deep rumble pulled her from her thoughts. You are the one who's made it to the Alpha King. Out from the darkness, there came a man, a feral-looking, red-eyed man whose appearance and aura screamed rogue. This man wasn't Damon. This was a rogue. Rogues. They were feral werewolves who had lost most of their sanity. All they did was kill, and kill. That's all. Werewolves have been trying to wipe them all out for a while now, but haven't succeeded. This man was one of them. One of those feral creatures who could kill her without even blinking. This was bad. Really bad. Sarah took a step back, the sound of her heartbeat reaching her ears loud and clear. Ba-dump, ba-dump. One heartbeat after another, hitting her chest with such intense pain. I'm sure you were expecting to see your mate, he grinned devilishly. Sarah could hear the mockery in his voice at the mention of the word mate. But I have been asked to keep you company. Hopefully, I won't bore you to death. I have been asked to keep you company. After those words reached her ears, Sarah realized that this wasn't just some mere coincidence. This was a setup. Something planned by none other than Alexis. But what was her goal? To get her killed? Sarah's terror grew impossibly higher, so much so that she could hardly even breathe. The man looked over her terrified figure in a very unsettling way, and his eyes threw her that look that Mr. Knack usually gave her whenever he was about to punish her. Sarah's feet chose that time to feel heavy, but she would have it. She forced her feet backwards inch by inch, sweat rolling down the sides of her face due to how anxious she was becoming. As she moved backwards, she kept her eyes trained on him cautiously. His ribs were jutting out disgustingly, giving the idea that he hadn't eaten in a long while. His cheeks were hollow, his lips were dried and chapped, and there was a bloody chain connecting his hands to the wall. Sarah's eyes happened to have trailed along his shackles. That was when she found that it had been severed somewhere in the center. There was nothing keeping him from hurting her. Nothing that was restraining him from rushing forward and slitting her throat with his claws. Nothing at all. Sarah dropped her stare. Now wasn't the time to look around. Now was the time to run. Run for her life. At that point, the heaviness in her feet was long forgotten. Now there was only adrenaline coursing through her. She turned on her feet and made a dash for the stairs. Her right foot was about to land on the first stair when fingers grabbed onto her hair and yanked her backwards, causing her to stumble back and collide with his chest. She was too late. Or rather, too slow. The feeling of his hard, calloused skin on hers made her completely drain of color. His fingers grazed her neck as he reached around and gathered her hair in both hands from behind, so he could rest his chin atop her shoulder. His breath fanned the skin of her cheeks, tensing her muscles and stopping her breaths. The feeling was as repulsive as it was terrifying. "You're one stupid woman," he cackled, yellow teeth on full display. One of his hands released her hair and traveled around her waist, then up her chest, running over her breast. He had already taken out his claws, judging by the slight sting that she felt as his fingers ran over her. "It's kind of hard to believe that you're the Alpha King's mate." The feeling of helplessness that suddenly overwhelmed Sarah caused tears to leave her eyes in abundance. She couldn't do anything at that moment, nothing at all, except to stand and take whatever he had in store for her. Pain. She didn't want to feel it, but if she stayed in this position or if she tried to escape his clutches, pain would be exactly what she would feel. One thing was for sure. She was doomed. Sarah gathered the last of her courage and tightened her hold on the key as she began to stutter. "Please don't hurt me." She knew she sounded and looked pitiful, but she didn't care. Her life was at stake. She had to at least beg for mercy. "Oh, I won't hurt you," he assured, sliding his fingers between her breasts, then encircling its outline through her clothes. "Your mate is the one who will deal with you." Before Sarah could even try to figure out what he meant, the rogue removed his hands from her body and slammed his palms down on both sides of her head. Pain immediately engulfed her. Even her ears stopped functioning as normal. Little by little, black dots started to cloud her vision until all she could see was complete darkness. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 12. Worse Than Beasts. When Sarah's eyes fluttered open, she was surrounded by the same darkness that had dwelled even before she blacked out. Her only source of light were the little streaks that escaped through the barred window. Sarah lifted her head a bit and glanced around in confusion. It wasn't until she saw the shackles left on the floor that she remembered the events from a few minutes ago. Fear instantly gripped her, causing her to shuffle to her feet and rush off towards the exit, despite the slight headache she was experiencing. The rogue was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah didn't think too hard on it. All her mind was set on was escaping this frightening place. She snatched the key from the floor as she was passing by it and started up the stairs. Once at the top, she pulled the door open and was ready to make a beeline for her room. But the two figures which stood behind the door stopped in her tracks. Damon was standing there, eyes staring down at her as Alexis clung to his arm as if her life depended on it. Damon's eyes traveled over her face, then moved downward, pausing on the key that was in her hands. First it was confusion, then disbelief, then it was betrayal, and next was anger. The range of emotions was enough to make Sarah realize that she was in deep shit. Alexis wasn't after her life as she originally thought. Instead, she was after Damon. He was her goal from the start. She lied to her and told her to come to this place, knowing that she would have unintentionally set the rogue free. Damon would then believe that she had betrayed him. Sarah darted her gaze towards Alexis, who was giving her a smug look from under her lashes. The side of her lips had pulled upwards as she tightened her hold on Damon's arm. Sarah's whole body pulsed with rage. How could Alexis do so much because of one man? It wasn't like Damon had declared his undying love for her, or anything even close to that. So frankly, this was an extremely stupid, selfish, and despicable move, something that no human should have done. Then again, Alexis couldn't be considered human anymore. She was worse than the beasts. Sarah crooked her neck, her face void of emotion, as she stared at the devious woman in front of her, who even had the audacity to smirk. "How could you?" But before she could finish her sentence, Damon cut her off. "Shut up!" he seethed, his eyes flashing golden. Sarah took a step back. No, it wasn't his anger that had scared her. It was the raw hatred that danced in his eyes. She had never seen hatred so intense before, so deadly. This was it, the devil side people spoke of. the side that only knew wrath. Sarah could smell it. She could feel it in her bones. She could see it. This was the end of Mr. Nice Guy, and the beginning of the ruthless Alpha King. I didn't do anything. I swear. Sarah could barely find words. Well, I did, but it was Alexis who... I said, shut up, he repeated in a low but lethal voice. Sarah immediately swallowed her tongue. I am your Alpha, and your King. I told you not to speak, so do not disobey me. Dare to utter one more word, and I'll make sure you never speak again. His lips were twitching, his eyes were glaring daggers into her soul, and his hands were clenched at his sides. It was almost as if he wanted to hurt her, as if he didn't consider her as his mate anymore. Sarah's lips wobbled. She was both surprised and unsettled by his words and actions. If someone told her that this little exchange would happen, she would have never believed it. After all, they were finally beginning to click like any normal mates did. And if this misunderstanding didn't happen, then maybe they would have gotten much closer by now. But look where fate led her. To her doom. Sarah still couldn't believe this was happening. Damon never acted this way with her before. Well, yeah, he did seem a bit angry sometimes, especially that time when Alexis tried to get her in trouble. But after a while, he went back to normal. Perhaps the same will happen this time around, Sarah thought, trying to soothe her worries. All she needed to do was to wait a while until Damon realized that she's innocent, just like last time. He'd tell her to go to her room, then he'd deal with Alexis in private, and by tomorrow morning, there'll probably be no sign of her. Of course, she'd be getting punished for her conniving ways. Yes, that's exactly what will happen. Sarah nodded in accordance with her thoughts and smiled unconsciously. Damon managed to catch that smile, and the look that came onto his face afterwards wasn't pretty. Sarah immediately dropped her smile and straightened herself up as she patiently awaited for him to send her to her room. Alexis? Damon said. Sarah looked between the two as Damon turned his eyes to Alexis and pried her hand off him, the same emotionless look on his eyes. Sarah was starting to feel relieved. He was finally beginning to understand that she was the innocent one. However, nothing went as expected. Damon didn't pry her hand off him because he had figured out that she was the one who started this whole thing. He did it because he wanted her to fetch something for him, something that wouldn't work in Sarah's favor. Go fetch the chains, then tie her up in my room. Make sure she can't leave until I return. That was unfortunately what he said. Sarah almost thought she didn't hear him right, but when Alexis threw her a smirk and walked off, she knew for sure that she had heard him correctly. Panic started to come to life. This was getting serious. Damon shot her one last hateful glare, then turned on his heels and began to storm off. Without thinking, she grabbed onto his wrist as her eyes started to well up with tears. Damon, she muttered, her voice almost non-existent. Sarah felt his muscle tense under her hold, but he hadn't turned around to look at her. He stood as still as a stone. Sarah didn't let that trouble her. She couldn't allow things to stay as they were, especially since she was innocent. I didn't know that Rogue was down there. I just went because Alexis said you... Before she finished, he spun around to face her and ripped his arm out of her hold, his eyes flashing golden once again. Sarah stepped back at the sight of him, and to her surprise, Damon took one forward as well. I thought I told you to shut up. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced to the aside, then turned back to her angrily. He almost seemed like a maniac. Sarah gulped. and don't ever call me by my name." He stepped forward again, and Sarah took one back. "I am your alpha!" He took another step forward, his eyes painted with raw rage. Fear forced Sarah to take another step back as well, but she was unaware that she wouldn't be stepping on level ground. With a sharp cry, her foot slipped off the edge of the very first stair that led down the basement. Sarah's eyes bulged out of their sockets. Her body rocked back and forth twice as she tried to catch her balance. But while she was struggling to save herself, Damon simply stared. He didn't reach out to catch her. Last time she nearly fell off the stairs. He had grabbed her at the last minute. But this time, Sarah found that he didn't even seem concerned. In fact, his glaring eyes were saying the words, "This is what you get for betraying me." And when she finally begun to fall backward, Damon did the unthinkable. He turned and walked away. In that moment, her idea of Damon changed once more. At first, she thought he wasn't all that bad. Then, when she found out that he had hurt Alexis, she had thought that he was more cruel than he seemed. Now, she thought he was worse than beasts, just like Alexis. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 13. Lies. Sarah's eyes fluttered open to see a pair of hazel ones staring down at her. Her eyes widened, and she shuffled backwards on the cold floor, her back hitting against the hard wall. Pain shot through every fiber of her being at the action, causing her to hunch over slightly. Her head hurt, her limbs hurt, and there were even little cuts littering her skin. But her physical pain was a little less intense than her emotional one. Rather than being happy that they shared such a deep connection through their mate bond, she felt irritated. If this mate thing didn't exist, then maybe she wouldn't feel so betrayed, wronged, and scared. Maybe this wouldn't even have fazed her. "You're awake?" Damon asked, leaning forward over the edge of the bed, his eyes void and as cold as ice. Sarah flinched at the sound of his voice. She tried her best to shrink herself under his stare, but Damon seemed to stare harder at her the more she moved, so she kept herself still. A flash of guilt showed in Damon's eyes, and then within a second, it was gone. Sarah couldn't tell if she had really seen it or not, but either way, she didn't care. Whether he felt guilty or not didn't change the fact that he had watched her fall from the stairs, knowing that she could have died from it. Even if he thought she had done something wrong, that didn't justify harboring such intense coldness and hatred toward her. He didn't even attempt to grab her, for God's sakes. How could he? And what's worse, he had even chained her hands together despite her condition. If this was how he was going to treat her, then she might have thought wrong about their life together. Maybe it actually isn't better than life in the dungeons. Sadly. Locking her head in her arms, she darted her eyes to the floor. She didn't even feel comfortable staring into his eyes anymore. She knew what kind of deadly look he could display any moment now, and she didn't want to see it. Plus, for some reason his presence made her highly uneasy. To put it bluntly, she didn't even want to see his face nor hear him breathe. But no matter how hard she tried to loathe him just as much as she loathed Mr. Knack, she couldn't make herself do it. Yet he had managed to garner such intense hatred for her in just a matter of mere minutes. He was truly the ruthless Alpha King everyone spoke of. "You're going to be bathing, sleeping, and eating in this room from now on. That way, I'll be able to keep a close eye on you. The moment I confirm that you're still in contact with rogues, you will die, mate or not. So I suggest that you cut all ties with them from now on. Additionally, Tomorrow morning, I'll officially introduce you as my mate. I expect you to be as obedient as possible. One mistake, and you'll be punished." Damon informed her impassively. You could say he spoke as if he was speaking to a 5-year-old child. Sarah lifted her head to look around the room. The room was somewhat similar to hers, only a bit larger, and judging by the dark vibe she got from the dominance of the color black, it was Damon's room. But the room was the least of her worries. Damon had just threatened to kill her. That was the only thing worth dwelling on. "I cannot hurt you." Lie. "I will not hurt you." Lie. Everything he told her about not being able to hurt her were lies from the pit of hell. But what was the use of lying? To get her to trust him? Sarah clenched her jaws. This was stupid. Her whole life was stupid. "Look at me when I speak to you." A command came out from Damon's pursed lips. Sarah reluctantly did as told, but she didn't look into his eyes directly. Instead, she stared at the spot between them. "You got something to say?" "Why did this have to happen to me?" was what Sarah wanted to say, but the words that actually came out of her mouth were entirely different. "Since you hate me so much, why don't you just send me back to where I came from?" "There's nowhere for you to go back to. I killed them all and burned the place to the ground." Sarah's stomach dropped. Damon didn't blink when he spoke those words. He didn't even show anything called remorse. He couldn't be serious, could he? There's no reason for him to do that. But this was Damon. He didn't need a reason to do things. He could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted to, because after all, he was the Alpha King. "Why?" Sarah barely managed to ask, her blue eyes starting to water and her voice cracking. There wasn't anyone there that she liked, but still, she didn't hate them to the point where she'd kill them. They were living beings, and all living things deserve to live. Instead of answering her question, Damon got up from his sitting position and made his way towards her. Ignoring the way her limbs burned when she moved, Sarah pushed herself closer to the wall and stuffed her head between her knees, her heartbeat quickening as panic invaded her. What was he planning on doing? He had threatened to kill her just moments ago. Who knew what he would do to her now? But Damon stopped in his tracks after taking only a few steps forward. Sarah peeked up at him when he found that she couldn't hear his footsteps. "Don't get me wrong. I didn't do it because they hurt you," Damon began, eyes still as cold as ever. "I did it to show my supremacy. I cannot portray myself as a weak king in front of my subjects. Therefore, I must show them that no one can harm me nor anyone close to me and live to tell the tale." Without even a hint of remorse, he threw what looked to be a folded dress onto her head, then walked off in the other direction. He might not have felt anything after killing those people, but as for Sarah, his words had dropped like a bomb onto her shoulders. He killed them to show his superiority? Then Lord only knows what he'd do to her now that he loathes every bone in her body. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 14. Hunters. Sarah sat on the floor, curled up against the wall with her head resting on her knees. She had been in the same position ever since her conversation with Damon. Her eyes were stinging, probably from lack of sleep, but Sarah wouldn't close her eyes. Her mind was too preoccupied. She hadn't slept throughout the night, not even for a second. Aside from thinking about how bad of a life she had also been watching Damon mumbling and shifting around in his sleep. She had no idea what he was dreaming about, but she figured he was reliving a bad experience. And though Sarah didn't want to, she still pitied him. Yet the one who needed pity the most was her. Everything was weighing down on her shoulders. She almost felt as if she would black out by any minute. Plus, the pain from falling down the stairs still hurt a lot, but not as much. It was quite puzzling, though. A fall from that height should have probably broken a few bones or so, but Sarah only felt pain in her limbs and head. Not an immense kind of pain that couldn't be bared, though. Perhaps she got lucky for once in her life? Damon dragged her out of her thoughts as he walked out from the bathroom with his phone held to his ears. His eyebrows were pulled together, and his lips were set into a thin line as he listened to the person on the other end of the call. "Jacob, just do as I say, will you? The southern border doesn't need much patrols since it leads out to the human territory. Yeah, we've eradicated most of the hunters in that area, but Maxim doesn't know that. He won't risk going that route. I'm sure of it." Sarah looked up at him at the mention of the word hunters. Hunters were a small number of humans scattered around the globe. Their only goal is to eradicate as much werewolves as possible. You could say they were the only ones who were brave enough to rebel. Sarah knew a great deal in that area since her father was one of them. He was her role model back in the days, but after he died during a battle and she was left to live on the streets by herself, most of her memories of her family disappeared with time. "I expect you to be ready by the time I finish my phone call." Damon was standing by the door now, one hand still holding the phone to his ear, while the other was grasping the door as he looked over at her. Sarah couldn't deny the fact that he looked extravagantly beautiful. He was wearing a black tuxedo that fitted him just right, hugging his body in a way that his broad shoulders and thick muscles weren't hidden. And just like the day when she first saw him, his black hair was caught at the back with a few unruly strands dancing in his vision. His hazel eyes were staring at her intensely. It almost seemed as if he wanted to see into her very soul. She could still see the hatred as clear as day in them. However, there was a small streak of confusion there as well. Sarah cocked her head. Was he finally beginning to doubt that she betrayed him? No, that couldn't be it. She shook away that thought. Yesterday, when he returned to the room after leaving, she had bottled up the courage to tell him once again that she hadn't known that the rogue was in the basement. Of course, she had requested for the permission to speak first. However, Damon had practically slapped her in the face when he told her to shut up before she even finished speaking. He obviously wasn't open to the idea of her being innocent. Frowning at the memory, she casted her gaze away from him and returned her chin to her knee. But she missed the glare that Damon had sent her afterwards. To him, she looked too well. By tradition, he could have killed her at the moment he found out that she was in league with rogues, but he couldn't make himself lay his hands on her. His wolf counterpart had successfully done everything in his power to prevent that from happening. Sadly, he should have crushed her bones and peeled her skin from her body, but he had let her off. For the second time in his life, the mate bond had made him weak and powerless, just like 10 years ago. But this time around, he had something planned, something that decides whether Sarah lives or dies. "Alpha, are you listening?" Jason called out to him over the phone. "Yeah, what did you say?" Damon quickly shoved his thoughts aside and walked through the door before slamming it shut, making Sarah flinch. She turned to look at the closed door, her frown still in place. She hadn't forgotten about the event today. She just tried hard not to think too much about it. It wasn't that she was scared or nervous to be introduced to all the high-ranking werewolves. More like she wasn't interested in going. She didn't see the point now that he had hated her guts. Was it against the rules to not introduce his mate? Then again, he was the one who made the rules. He could break it if he wanted to. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's frown deepened. Why was he knocking when the door wasn't even locked from the inside? She stayed glued to the floor, but another series of knocks forced her to reluctantly get up. She winced at the sudden cramps in her limbs that was mixed with a sharp sting of pain. "You really love to see me in pain, don't you?" she mumbled under her breath as she shambled over to the door. The shackles felt disturbing on her hands, but she had to bear with it. He'd probably lock her in the basement if she complained to him about it. Finally arriving at the door, she reached her hands forward and managed to sloppily twist the knob. But the face she saw when she pulled the door open made anger spread through her veins like wildfire. Alexis.